I was saying thank you so much, Flores, for the introductions. I thought before we get started with our discussion, we could maybe share, like what has drawn us to this field? What are we passionate about? What are we currently exploring? Why are we here talking about psychedelics and creativity? And I'll have maybe Manesh go first and give us a little intro on that, and then we can go round robin and then get started.
For sure. Yeah. Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, Floris and Alex, for inviting us to give this presentation. We opted rather than Stephanie and I giving a presentation and discussing after that, we're just going to have a discussion for the whole session here. I think we have a lot of interesting things we want to get into, and I think it'll be a lot of fun to riff with each other. And so, in terms of my interest in psychedelics and creativity, it largely comes from experiences I've had that have shown me the potential for psychedelics to shift us out of our usual way of framing either problems in our life or really just perceiving the world in general. And that's actually one of the things that inspired me to become a psychedelic neuroscientist, and just witnessing through my experiences and reading those of others how much our experience of the world and framing of things in our lives can be pigeonholed into one perspective. And we often think that this is the only perspective and it's hard to escape from it. And find that psychedelics allow us to shift that a little bit. And as we might, as is said in like insight research, we can restructure the problem sets of our life, right? We can reconceptualize what's going on and how it relates and ask different questions. And that just really fascinated me in a general sense in terms of understanding how our brains and minds create the reality that we experience and how we can change that to have different lines of thought and different ways of experiencing that. Um, that's the general picture. On a lower level, I love to play guitar and improvisational guitar, and I find that psychedelics just enable my creativity to go to a different level. It's much easier for me to escape kind of well-worn patterns and motifs and melodies that I usually gravitate towards, and just I just naturally am able to explore a greater repertoire of melodies and motifs just naturally after taking a psychedelic, either that day or even in the week afterwards. So I think there's a lot of untapped potential here for things like this. And so
Okay.
yeah, Stephanie, do you want to go next?
Sure. For those who know me or, who've talked to me about this topic, I always say that growing up and I had this exploration of, or this question of, am I the artist? Am I the scientist? Am I the artist or am I a scientist? And it was strange because I loved it all. And, later in life, obviously I picked, science for a career, but later in life, I realized that I was able to cultivate these artistic passions and, have them be more than hobbies in my life. And as Flores mentioned, I founded an artist collective and a music label and brought music into my life that way. But, on a personal level, music, singing, piano. I was classically trained on the violin, so it's always really been a big part of my life. I really enjoy writing. And what I've realized when I think about this question and when I think about this pull between arts and science, I realize there is no real division. It is the creative mind, and we are all born with a creative mind. It's just how tenure the field. How do you tend to that field? What do you do with it, right? And the other thing that I just really love to talk about is this line that we've drawn between recreation and therapy in medicine. Obviously, in my work, in my professional work, I'm above ground. I'm very much immersed in the medical and therapeutic field, but I realize that the line between these two areas isn't quite as solid and as divisive as it should be. Recreational experiences can be so therapeutic. Obviously, we encourage safety and responsibility, but there is so much healing in joy, and there is so much freedom that comes with creativity. And this is kind of what I like to think about and what I like to talk about. And I like blurring these lines between the creative brain and the scientific brain and the recreation and the therapy, and realizing that it's all, very much the same. Psychedelics are this gateway into this world. But I mean, music and art on its own is just so inherently psychedelic. You don't need a substance. So I'm very inspired by all of these topics. And so I'm excited to be here chatting about them all with you. Bruce.
Well, I think I come from the class of trippy kids
Mhm.
born in the 1960s in Canada, sort of watching as the culture really shifted, but being really attracted to nerdy topics like programming computers and the big questions of science, like the origin of life. Really got attracted to that when I was a teenager. Watching space open, I got attracted to that. And suddenly, kind of in my mid to late teens, I realized that these downloads were occurring and I could get flashes of insight, like a spacecraft design that I sent off to space people and got responses when I was in high school, or a vision of how molecules self-assemble when I just had bare knowledge of chemistry. So I kind of tried to cultivate that. But as the 80s came on, there was the drug wars as well. So the psychedelic culture had gone completely underground and died out in large parts of the culture. And it was only in the late 90s, meeting Terence McKenna, where I finally got my introduction. This is in my mid 30s. And from that point on, experimenting, self experimenting with the different classic psychedelics at different doses and watching how my mental structures moved, I realized that once I had completed my healing work, my revealing powers became much amplified. And in fact, in some sense, at that point, psychedelics and blends of things like breath work and meditation, those became an elixir rather than medicine. So the elixir opens the worlds to magic. And I was able to work on the problem of the origin of life and come back, bring a visionary uh, sort of a vision back into science, into a hypothesis that's now created a paradigm shift in our field. It actually helps to determine where the rovers drive on Mars, to look for past evidence for life on Mars, if there ever was life there. So I came out of the closet a couple of years ago, realizing this could be inspiring, perhaps. It could be a career ender, but it also could be inspiring for young people coming up that there's something here. And that led to the Center for Minds being established. And we can talk a little bit more about that later, but it's been quite a journey. And I think we're just cracking the door again on this incredible potential that psychedelics have for, of course, our well-being, but then our our ways to see our outsight into the universe and how we might remake our world. And I'll finish there and let the discussion begin.
I love all these stories. Um, okay, so we wanted to kick it off by talking a little bit about the neuroscience behind flow state and creativity. So, we've all been there, that moment where we have the answer, right, to the question we've been pondering or the problem we've been trying to solve. So now that we have, I guess, this like solution in our hands, but there's this an experience with this moment, there's feelings. What's happening in the brain when we're in the process of ideating? What changes when we have the aha moment? Manesh, maybe you can get us started there.
For sure. Yeah. So the cognitive neuroscience of creativity has expanded as a field a lot over the last 10 years. And there's a lot of research being done on these questions of what are the dynamics of the creative process and how does that relate to different brain networks and their interactions? And yeah, what's unique about the aha experience of this new insight that just storms into our consciousness out of nowhere, it seems. Um, so one way to understand creativity is in two primary aspects. One is we need to generate ideas. We need to generate materials to work with. These are memories, past experiences, concepts. These are the raw materials of which thought and creativity is made of. And then there's the process of evaluating, working with these materials, recombining them, creating new connections, and then generating novel ideas. And so on the generation side, a lot of evidence suggests that this is related to the default mode network. Many of you have probably heard of that. It's kind of a buzzword in the psychedelic space. And how I understand this network is that it's the abstraction network. It allows us to create concepts and abstractions that go beyond the concrete particulars of experience and allow us to manipulate a lot of information very efficiently. And it's also involved in associative thinking and mental simulation or imagination. And so a core part of creativity is just that imagination, having ideas come up, associatively linking them in an unconstrained, relatively spontaneous way, right? We all know in the creative process, one of the worst things you can do is be constantly evaluating as you're ideating. Often you want to have an ideation phase of letting it all out, stream of consciousness, and evaluating afterwards. And so during generation, you get this default mode network activity induce, allowing for the emergence of knowledge and information and concepts to work with, and then you play with it. And then you can, using a different network called the frontal parietal control network or executive network, you're then able to work with these materials, think about how they relate to a particular defined problem that you have, and use our deliberate attention to manipulate and link these ideas together. And so creative cognition is kind of this back and forth iterative process of generating things, evaluating, playing with them in a more focused way, and then relaxing that again and going back and how did the structure of it change? What new ideas are coming? And this kind of iterative process of refining between generating and evaluating ideas. And so in the brain, this is this dynamic dance between the default mode network, which is kind of spontaneous information generation, and frontal parietal or executive network, which is focused cognitive control problem solving. And often, in some way, on our own time scale, we'll dance between these. And then, okay, so then what happens when we have an insight, right? So an insight is usually defined as a moment where an idea or a new connection or solution comes into our mind abruptly and with a distinct sense of relief and pleasure. It's like, oh, I get it. That's it. Oh, that brings us all together. And I kind of mentioned this in my intro. That moment is often associated with either you realizing you had been framing the question incorrectly or in a different way and restructuring how you view the information you have, or just finding a new connection between distinct concepts. And what's interesting is in that state, you get a couple of signatures. One is you get increased gamma wave activity in a part of your brain called the superior temporal gyrus. So basically, this part of the brain integrates semantic conceptual information in new ways. And so you get this flash of gamma, which is very high frequency activity, binding together concepts in a new way. And it's like right here in your anterior temporal lobe. And so you get this moment where it's like you imagine all this materials floating around, then boom, they collapse into a new integrated connection. And you get this flash of really fast, high frequency gamma activity. And what's interesting at the same time is you get increased alpha in other parts of your brain, which relate to cutting off the external world and going internally. And so insight is this state where you get this sudden burst of activity of novel connections between concepts simultaneously.
You're frozen. They'll probably come back. Give them a second. All right, maybe I'll jump in and or we can just keep going, Bruce, until Manesh comes back. Oh, there he is. He's back. Okay.
Oh, I'm back. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry about that. In any case, insight is this, it happens at some point during the creative process. We're not in, it's a lot of conditions. Maybe Bruce and Stephanie, you could talk about the conditions that allow for insight to arise, but it's this unique brain state that emerges of gamma and alpha waves changing and this kind of integration of our information in a new way. And yeah, I'll leave it there. There's more I can go into, but I think that's a good gist of it.
It's so interesting because wouldn't you say that, you have all these observations when you have these epiphanies, when you're in a flow state, when you're creating. And what's interesting is if we give someone a psychedelic, right, and we observe, we're going to see some of the same phenomena occur. on a neurochemical level with, different neurotransmitters like serotonin, oxytocin, dopamine. And I think it's just so fascinating that in these different states, whether it's a creative state, whether you're listening passively to music, whether you're actively engaging by dancing, or whether you've taken a psychedelic substance, if we observe what's going on, it's a lot of the same.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. It is kind of, we would say, a scientist domain general. It's a
Right.
generalized process that applies to different applications. And one thing I could also add to end my little monologues here, set of monologues, is how this relates to psychedelics, right? One way of conceptualizing it is that psychedelics really enhance the generation side of things. Because during generation, you want your executive control to relax. You want to just to make these crazy new associations, to create a volume of new ideas, a volume of concepts. And so psychedelics seem to relax the constraints we have on our cognitive function and what we're thinking about, allowing for this relatively unconstrained, hyper-associative mode of thinking, which is often also very visual. It's very imagistic. So you get this very visual, often symbolic, metaphorical mode of thinking that allows us to move from our usual rational constraints and create new connections. And in that process, you're able to potentially have an insight, restructure the problem in a new way, have a bunch of ideas you wouldn't have had otherwise. That then perhaps after the psychedelic experience, you can then evaluate and like, okay, how much of this was actually good? How much of this was kind of like interesting stuff in the moment, which is kind of nonsensical now? And you can come to that grounded realization afterwards. But I think understanding psychedelics as potent amplifiers of the creative generation aspect is a good way to see it from my view.
If I might jump in here, Stephanie and Manesh, I can give the audience a specific example of this, how this might work, and maybe it will resonate with some of you out there. This is from a wonderful book by James Fadiman, by Jim Fadiman, published about a decade ago, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. And in it, in the central section of the book, he describes a study that he was part of with Willis Harman in the middle 1960s. And this study took 23 professionals into a clinic and gave them mostly, in the case of the study, it was mescaline, but in some cases LSD. And the professionals were actually primed, in a sense, to work on a problem. So they had a setup phase where they were working on a problem, a technical problem, a design problem, a math problem, and they were sort of assigned to work on this. And a particular of all the participants, 2/3 actually came out with solutions that were implementable. And the one that really stands out for me is the architect. So if I can read from this, so this architect had taken mescaline, and then later in the session, he said he picked up my sketch pad and some colored felt tip pens and made myself comfortable. I opened the pad, picked up the felt tip pen, was ready to work, but I was completely blank at that point. So he was trying to work on a particular problem, which was the design of a shopping center on a particularly small lot of land. And this shopping center had had 6 previous proposals by other architects rejected. So it was a well-known problem. It was a well-known design problem. Since this is psychedelics and design, I thought it'd be great to bring this in from 60 years ago. So instead of using his pad, he said, I closed my eyes. I did not try to think. I waited, but not in anticipation of anything, much as I had in the later part of the morning. And that was during his acute phase mescaline experience. Within minutes, it flashed to complete life. I could see the completed shopping center. The trees were grown, cars were parked in the parking area, fountains splashed, running water, and people walked through the building and the gardens, and I could walk through it too. And then he goes on to say, then during the next hour and a half, I drew as rapidly as I could. The drawings were sketchy, but captured the essence of the vision I had in my head. Many specific details were recorded on paper. And then later, so he showed the sketches to the client a few days later, and they were approved, complete. And then remarkably, he says, I had, without scaling the original sketches, laid out 3 acres of buildings, parking, outdoor theater, et cetera, in their exact dimensions, and had kept it in my head as clear as it had been when I walked through it in his post-psychedelic, sort of post-acute visioning session. And this is kind of a beautiful rendition of what the power of this particular medium or catalyst is. And if you want to look up the original paper, it's Harmon et al., Psychedelics as Creative Catalysts for Problem Solving, 1966. And what Minds is doing is trying to bring this kind of science back. And it is on its return. Probably a half a dozen teams are doing something to do with creative problem solving, aided by psychedelics and other practices. But this is sort of the historical framework of a direction in science that was abandoned just as the therapeutic side of psychedelics was criminalized.
That study is such a landmark in the exploration of psychedelics, and I refreshed my memory yesterday on it actually, because we talked about it, and it just shows us that the tools for unlocking creative breakthrough have always been within our reach. And I think it's up to us to wield them responsibly and with a commitment to collective growth and innovation. And it also, in this case, it was a designer and an architect. And so there's an element of productivity. But I think sometimes we get bogged down by what did I make? What did I produce? But sometimes it's just about creating, and maybe it has no use, maybe it isn't about productivity. But yeah, having that commitment to a collective growth. I think that's kind of my takeaway from this.
Now, Stephanie, I wanted to ask you a question, which is what Manesh and I have talked to or referred to as more of the visual aspect, the sort of 3D visual cortex aspect of vision and insight. For you, how is that actually captured in the body, the somatic genius, if you will, of each of our bodies?
Yeah, I love talking about embodiment because I've been asked this question in other ways, and I've also just been asked about on a medical level because I studied pharmacology. It's like you have all of this knowledge that lives up inside your head about drugs and how they affect the body, how the body will then react to the drugs, and you walk around with this knowledge and you feel like, okay, I'm empowered to make choices because I really understand on a very deep level, really like on the cellular level. But I noticed that it could all just be up in your head and there's no embodiment, there's no awareness. And I think that the skill, or the practice rather, is to embody and integrate and weave it into ourselves. And that leads to a greater understanding. And I think that, these experiences are profound catalysts for just that. I think that it can lead to a deeper understanding that then leads to the embodiment of it. And I think you're the one who told me that we talk about embodied intelligence versus visual intelligence. And I mean, I'm interested to see how you both interpret some of that, but I think about people who create with their hands or athletes that use their bodies, and it goes beyond muscle memory. Like I play piano, or any kind of instrumentalist has a muscle memory. It's like, how to read the music up here, over here. Now, how is that translating to your hands? And how is it that when you learn a piece of music, you can put that sheet away and play it from memory? It goes beyond just being able to visualize what was on the page. It is now coursing through your veins. And so that's how I kind of think about this embodied intelligence. I think about a somatic expression of what we've learned and then applying it. I think that, again, these experiences with psychedelics, they enable individuals to access deeper parts of their psyche and view the world with complete fresh perspectives. And for a creative, because, we are talking about psychedelics creation and design, it's this unboundness, like it's a dissolving of all the bounds of conventional thinking. And I think that it is a conscious almost effort to then take what we see and what we experience around us and then embody it. But I'm curious to see, like, how do you guys think of this embodied intelligence versus the visual?
I can jump in here really quick. That was really great, Stephanie. Thank you for that. I think for me, something that this points to is just the integrated nature of mind and body, right?
Mm.
The fact that we highlight the brain and body nervous system as distinct organs is basically a convention of language. It allows us to understand these things and study them in more detail, but in reality, it's all such a complex, integrated system. And our cognitive experience, our cognitive life is deeply intertwined with feeling states in our bodies and our interoception, as it's called, where interoception is our ability to experience and represent the different feeling states of our body, whether it's temperature, hunger, or various other sensations. And I think psychedelics provide a means of reintegrating ourselves with our somatic selves, right? Becoming reattuned with our body, not being just brains floating in these little meat puppets, right? Like we're an integrated organism, right? And so I think cognitive intelligence and somatic intelligence go hand in hand, because for decision making, for acting, for perhaps even evaluating curative insights, we have to be in tune with our feeling, our kind of hedonic responses, our sensations. And I think in the absence of that, how are we going to really know if something really lands or is right for us? I think, our emotional experiences, decision making, evaluation processes deeply intertwined with the body. And so I think, in these visionary states with psychedelics, yeah, we often emphasize, oh, we're experiencing these beautiful landscapes, or I was able to conceptualize novel designs for this, whether designing a website or a building or whatever, drug development or whatever. It's like at the moment you're having that experience, you're experiencing something emotionally, you're experiencing something somatically. You're not just having these detached visions. There's always a somatic component. I think that's under acknowledged in a lot of cases. And we have to recognize that, you thinking that your insight and your experience or your vision is important and salient is because of how it feels, right? And I think we need to not overlook that. And so I think, the grounding in the body and of embodying any even personal insights into our automatic behaviors, and which is an embodied thing, is a core part of psychedelic healing as well, right? So I really can't, in the end, separating visual and embodied intelligence is kind of like a convention of language to allow us to speak of it, but really it's also deeply intertwined.
Bruce, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, David Luke has a really good term for this. And David Luke is a researcher colleague in the UK. He calls it perspectivalism or perspectivism, and points to a lot of aha moments in science did come through the bodies of scientists, uh, such as the visualization of the benzene ring as an Ouroboros, as a snake eating its tail, uh, came to a scientist in the 19th century. The embodiment of uh, the feeling of the nature of photosynthesis by Dennis McKenna, and a story that he reported about 10 years ago with ayahuasca. My own experience was becoming a protocell, the unit at the beginning of life, the very first things that we were forming in the laboratory, but we didn't know where to take them from there. And my particular psychedelic assisted aha moment was to become the protocell, attempting its first division, changing the entire framework of which I'd ever thought about life's beginning. It wasn't a very simple chemistry. It was the full throttle moment of the first cell division. And then I had to work backwards from there. But I was that protocell, and I felt it and I screamed. And it was a deeply implanted memory and vision, which I think I couldn't have recovered so vividly if it hadn't been embodied, if it hadn't been emotionally connected. It wouldn't have landed. It would have been a fleeting moment, like when you wake up from a dream and it was so vivid. You may have been having this dream for an hour and it's gone within a minute. If your partner asks you, what did you dream last night? And you know that you dreamed something fundamentally vivid and important, and it's completely gone. So that's the fragility of visual recall. But I think both of you are right. If it's embodied and it's tied in with emotion, it's fully present. You more fully experience it, and it becomes part of you. So that's really important.
This is making me
Wonderful.
think of Huxley's work a little bit. Just thinking about the concept of the mind at large. And we have filters and we perceive reality through certain filters. There's so much coming at us every day, and our brain can only handle so much, so we think. And there's like a filter that reduces all of this overwhelming amount of information. And I think that what we're realizing is that psychedelics tosses that filter out of the window, it disables that filter. And now you're perceiving reality more directly and expansively. It's this unfiltered view. And so then what you have to take all of it and now you got to integrate it. And I think that's the work. And then to your point about the dreams, there's work there too. I think there's a whole exploration of the dream life. You got to either speak it out loud to your partner when your partner says, "What did you dream about?" Or turn to your partner and say, "I had this crazy dream," and then talk about it. Or you got to write it down. But I think there's a tool there that a lot of us are not paying attention, or maybe we are. I don't know, but I think that it's overlooked. And I've often experienced dream life as an extension of waking life. I shared with you both that I've written entire articles or speeches and woken up and be frantically grabbing like pens and papers and like trying to write it down before I forget it. But it shows you that it is an extension and it can be used as a tool for integration and mind expansion.
One of the one
Yeah.
of the tools that to add to what you're saying, Stephanie, I decided when I was a little kid that something really weird was going on. When I closed my eyes, I could see this patterning behind closed eyes in a dark room. Like,
Mhm.
what is that? And so the tool I developed to get that pattern to resolve into color images, like an old-fashioned color TV, was an observer function. I had to pack myself into the smallest possible sphere, sort of crystal sphere with no thought going on at all, and then the field would get more vivid, and it would start to render into scenes.
Hmm.
And so, coming to psychedelics, the full throttle of Terence McKenna's mushrooms, hitting my as my field just started to dissolve, I went into blackness. I jumped into the crystal observer, and I, I I watched myself as two beings, one that was the experiencer, and the other was this kind of humorous, neutral observer. But the observer had another tool, which was a camera, a high-speed camera that it could run and make recordings. And so in the full throttles of a psilocybin experience, you can't record a whole lot, but you can actually pattern down some of it. In the post-acute phase, I found that I could do more recording, and I could even rewind and kind of re-experience something that had just flashed past and make it etching in my memory. That then, as you pointed out, you reach for your notebook later. But one of the things I want to point out is uh, we can't sort of ignore the ineffable elephant in the room, which means that these places are so extraordinary. They're beyond language. Uh, Sometimes they're even beyond memory. They're beyond any description or any retrieval to the normal waking world. They're just absolutely extraordinary, and they're to be experienced, I think, for themselves in that moment, in their full potential, in their full potential high weirdness, as Eric Davis describes it. And not we can't sort of try to package them and productize them, and we just have to sort of, in a sense, be in awe each time we go back to the very, very high states. And so in no way meant to disrespect those incredible states. But the uh, anyhow, there are beautiful things that we can come back with our healing, and then also are revealing. And I think Floris is going to open it up to questions.
You have about 5 more minutes for the conversation, and participants can, at the moment, already submit questions, and Alex will ask them on camera.
So for those 5 minutes, I had a question I wanted to pose to you, Bruce, but then I would love to get your thoughts on it too, Stephanie, and then I can maybe add something at the end. But Bruce, you in particular, you often talk about setting, and setup, right? And so, and in the context of using psychedelics for creativity, for this kind of visionary experience, the setup and the set and setting might be, well, very likely is different than that used in psychedelic therapy, right? And we're still in the process of figuring out what are the optimally conducive settings for using psychedelics for creativity, because that's a unique problem. So can you speak a little bit on what you mean by set and setting, and maybe bridge that into what we're doing with minds and what we're thinking about in terms of developing ways to study that and push the needle forward?
Yeah, I think there's an immense history of problem solving, creativity, and insight. And around one of the great mysteries of human experiences, how do we cultivate flashes of insight and then land them in the world? This is one of the great tool sets that human beings have. I think there's so many approaches, but one of them is patience, is a patient absorbing of all the aspects of the question and reading and really giving yourself good inputs. Having a mentor, for example, having peers to bounce things off. And then you come up to a doorway, a sort of stop point where no one's been able to go beyond that door. And then you ask the ether, you ask the field, or whatever it is, the mind at large, can you please help give us a clue? And it may or may not show up in a given moment. It may come in a walk in the woods, in those sorts of settings. But in the psychedelic space, it's a request, not a command. And it's a hope. It's a hope of a dream, in a sense, to come. And so patience is so required. In my case, it was probably the 25th or 30th ayahuasca session that the origin of life was even addressable as a thing within my session. There was a lot of other exploration before that. So I think that the work of minds, one of the things we're doing is running a survey to find what's going on out there. Are people using these tools for their creative problem solving as well as for their healing and for improving their lives? And just trying to find what are the protocols that tend to return the goods. And you have to be in the right zeitgeist. You have to be in the correct community to actually land these things. There's so many factors, such an enormous space.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Steph, do you have something to add there in terms of set up and how you facilitate in yourself?
I think I want to maybe it's adjacent, maybe it's totally related. I'm not sure, but this just makes me think about how there's like we talk about a practice, right? And we have to practice. You talked about calling things in, it's not a demand, it's a question, but it's creating a ritual to be able to arrive at whatever it is we're trying to arrive at. And sometimes we enter these experiences, we don't know what we're trying to arrive at. But I do think that where we need to start is cultivating and creating a ritual. And it's developing a relationship with, whether it's a plant medicine or a different type of psychedelic, it's figuring out, how do I work with this? And that involves creating the setting, the environment. Who will guide us? Am I self-guided? Am I self-experimenting? If I'm by myself, what are the tools that I'm going to use? And I always, get a question about which one and how, and it seems so daunting. And yeah, it is. It could be really overwhelming, especially if this is like your first foray into this world. But I always say to just lead with curiosity and openness and embrace the questions, just kind of love the process of learning and don't get so bogged down by how and will I and how come and what's going to happen. It's just a surrender, I guess. And I think that if you can create the ritual, create the practice, maybe there are certain things that you repeat every single time, you'll find comforts in that, I guess like repetitive nature of the practice and the ritual. And then the rest is just a free form expansion. And you just kind of follow the yellow brick road. And I think that you can do the same without psychedelic substances. We talk about practices that are psychedelic without substance, going back to the music and the dancing, the meditation and the yoga. These are ancient forms of psychedelic practice. It's just that today, when we say psychedelic, the mind automatically goes to a chemical substance or a mind-altering plant. But yeah, so for me, it's like let's think about ritual. Let's think about ritual and use that ritual as like a guide throughout all of it. Yeah.
Yeah, these are great answers. I'll briefly add because I know we need to get to questions, but to bring it back to the neuroscience stuff I mentioned, in essence, with the ritual and with the setup, you're priming the flow of spontaneous thoughts generated by our default mode network, right? Your brain is constantly generating thoughts, but what that's generated by is a combination of our past experiences, our current experience, our emotional concerns, but through ritual and through, as Russo's pointing to, reading and really educating yourself on all the raw materials needed for the solution, you're priming your brain to have more resources and operate within a particular space to find that new connection. And so really it's you know, providing the raw materials and priming your brain to operate within the context that might be more amenable to the solution you're seeking for, right? And then once that's set up, relaxing and surrendering into it so that naturally these connections can free flow and form with each other, kind of dynamically and spontaneously without our control. So it's like a lot of control at the beginning, bringing it all in, setting ourselves up, priming, and then just like surrender and let go. And that's usually, when insight happens most.
Yeah, because the brain wants something certain, right? And so you lay the foundation, something you can trust. And I think there's a lot of like people's personalities can be quite like that too. It's like I'll travel, I'll explore if my foundation is solid. So that's kind of how I think about prepping with the setup, set and setting.
Awesome.